We continue our series going through the book of Acts. It's called Turning the World Upside Down. We'll continue to see how Jesus did that through the early church, turning the world upside down. When we look at our text, which is in Acts chapter 9, we're going to start in verse 32. As Peter toured the whole region, he went to visit God's people in Lydda. There he found a man named Aeneas, who was paralyzed and had been confined to his bed for 8 years. Peter said to him, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed." At once he got up. Everyone who lived in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. In Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek her name is Dorcas. Her life overflowed with good works and compassionate acts on behalf of those in need. About that time, though, she became so ill that she died. After they washed her body, they laid her in an upstairs room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, when the disciples heard that Peter was there, they sent 2 people to Peter. They urged, "Please come right away." Peter went with them. Upon his arrival, he was taken to an upstairs room. All the widows stood there beside him, crying as they showed the tunics and other clothing Dorcas made when she was alive. Peter sent everyone out of the room, then knelt and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, saw Peter, and sat up. He gave her his hand and raised her up. Then he called God's holy people, including the widows, and presented her alive to them. The news spread throughout Joppa, and many put their faith in the Lord. Peter stayed for some time in Joppa with a certain tanner named Simon. And this is the word of God for the people of God. Everybody remembers I assume they still make them, the Where's Waldo books. Yeah, everybody had a Where's Waldo. He has the really easy to see when you see him, the striped shirt, the red and white, and he's in plain sight. And when you see him in the page all the time, you're like, oh, he was right there. And there's many books like that. I have a Bible-themed one that has different scenes in the Old Testament, and the kids can find the parting of the Red Sea, and they can find the different fish there. And when you find things, they're in plain sight. They're right there in front of you. But I say they're hidden in all the busyness that is going on. And sometimes I feel like that's what it's like following Jesus. I say we're trying to imitate Jesus, trying to be like Jesus, and yet the busyness of life, the busyness of everything going around, all the things that pull on our attention saying this is good, do this, and do this, sometimes it can hide Jesus in plain sight right in front of us. And so I want to talk about that today, and I want to talk about if we were looking for Jesus, if Jesus was, the Where's Waldo, where would we find Jesus at today? And oftentimes it's in very unexpected places, as we will see. Now I think as we go through the book of Acts, it could have a subtitle that's, I didn't see that coming. Because essentially that's what happens, for the most part, every single chapter. Jesus goes away, and they're praying in a room, and suddenly fire comes down, like tongues of fire rest upon them, and a roaring wind. Didn't see that coming. Peter, a fisherman by trade, preaches a sermon, and 3,000 people become followers, or baptized by Jesus, become followers of Jesus. Didn't see that coming. The church radically starts to share their possessions and starts to share with each other and all of those in need. And God adds to their number every day. Didn't see that coming. And it goes on and on and on. And when in our place in the book of Acts, there's 3 chapters that really things begin to turn in ways that they didn't see it coming. And so far, before you get to chapter 8, you can think of the homeland. You think Judea, and Jesus said, "Spread the gospel, go to Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." So you can think of the homeland as Judea. They would have been comfortable there. They would have, understand the language and the culture. They would have known a lot of people. That would have been their in-group, the people that they understood, people that understood them. And so preaching the gospel, sharing Jesus, finding Jesus, you could say it would have been easiest right there. But in chapter 8, things they didn't see coming start to happen. And so it starts out with the Samaritans. Who are the Samaritans? Well, these are people that are, you could call them distant relatives of the Jewish people. They have a common heritage if you go back several hundred years, but they have this religion that's similar, but it's different enough to make people angry. And so they don't like each other. They look down upon each other, and it wasn't unknown that if you were a good Jewish boy or girl and you had to travel from point A to point B, you might go around Samaria because you don't want to associate with those people on the outside. And so where does the gospel go to? Where do people start experiencing the risen Christ? In Samaria. Didn't see that coming. It goes on, and then Simon the sorcerer is another story in there, and Simon the sorcerer becomes a follower of Jesus. And then you have the Ethiopian eunuch. You remember a few weeks ago, the Ethiopian eunuch, someone who would have been excluded from temple worship because he was an outsider. Because of his physical body, he would have been excluded, because he was a eunuch, excluded from temple worship. Someone that shouldn't have been there. So we have these outsiders in chapter 8. You go on, and you have the story. We talked about Saul, his later name came to be known as Paul. Someone who is a persecutor of the church, who's actively seeking to arrest people, arrest followers of Jesus. And suddenly he encounters the risen Christ. He finds Jesus in an unexpected way, and he becomes a follower of Christ. You jump over our passage, and we'll come back to it, and you go to chapter 10. And Cornelius. Cornelius is a Roman military official, so an occupying force. So imagine if you were occupied by an outside force, the Roman military. He's there. He's an official there. He's an officer in the army. And he becomes a follower of Jesus. He's a Gentile, somebody who's outside of the faith. Not even a Samaritan who kind of related. But he's outside. And so we see that the people that are become part of Jesus' in crowd are consistently on the outsiders. And in the early Christian movement, we see that Christians are often those who are outsiders and who are marginalized. We call them people that are on the outside. And so when I looked at our passage, and I'm trying to figure out, God, what are you speaking through this passage? At first glance, it seems like it doesn't fit in these few chapters. Because you have these really kind of radical people that are brought in, and although healings are extraordinary, kind of in the midst of all it seems like it's just kind of this little detail is thrown in there. But as I look closer, I see that the same thing is happening here. And so we have Peter. Peter goes to a man who has disabilities, has had disabilities for 8 years. And so not having social services, not having, have people provide things for him. He couldn't necessarily, get a wheelchair, couldn't get an aide to come and help, would have wholly relied upon his community, his family, to care for him in the many different ways that he would have needed it. And so he's an outsider. He may have had to resort to begging. If he's left alone, he won't make it because he doesn't have, there aren't social services that will come and necessarily check on him and make sure that he's okay. And Peter goes to the person who is an outsider, who has disabilities, and oftentimes in our culture, people who have disabilities are treated like they are outsiders as well, and heals in the name of Jesus. And then he goes on to the next place. He goes to Tabitha's, where Tabitha lived. Now Tabitha, again, her name means Dorcas, and with Monique, I feel bad calling her Dorcas. The middle school boy in me just feels bad. So we'll call her Tabitha, which means gazelle. She is the only woman in the Bible that is called a disciple. Now, you would read past this and you wouldn't even notice it because all that's happening. She is the only woman in the Bible that is called a disciple. Now, women were seen as the inferior sex. If you were going to have a child, you wanted a boy. There was a Jewish prayer at the time. Thank God that I was not born a woman. And so they were seen as the inferior sex. Their testimony may not have been, they couldn't testify in court. And so they weren't seen as, if you're getting disciples and you're bringing disciples in that culture, you're getting men. And yet we have Tabitha here, who is a woman who would have been an outsider in that sense that she would have seen as inferior, and she is named a disciple. Now, who is her ministry to? The poor. Outsiders. Specifically, it names widows. And so in the Bible, a lot of times widows and orphans are put together because, again, if you don't have social services, You don't have the government to be able to come in, provide, and you lose the people around you who would take care for you and provide for you. It left you few options. It left you few options. You would have had to maybe beg, or hopefully maybe somebody would be able to help you out. If you were a woman, it was even worse. Again, because you're already seen as the inferior sex. You may have had to resort to begging or even prostitution just to be able to survive. And so her ministry is among those who are poor, and it specifically names widows. And then there's this little bit on the end that is thrown in, and then Peter goes to stay with Simon the tanner. And so a tanner is someone who takes animal skin and turns it into leather. And so I'm not terribly familiar with the tanning process, but what I do know and what I read is that it smells horrible. And he would have smelled horrible. I mean, literally, just a guy that smelled bad. You would have smelled him before you saw him. And we know everybody, if he comes to sit and worship, they want to sit right next to him, right? Someone who had a profession who just by the nature of it would have made him smell bad, made him an outsider, and you're hanging around, you're around dead animals all day, and that wouldn't have been, the highly looked upon in the Jewish culture at the day, especially in the conservative end, And so we see over and over and over that this ministry of Jesus continues to be with those who are on the outside. I would say today, if you want to be in with Jesus, if you want to find Jesus, you need to be in with those who are on the outside, or stand with those who are on the outside. That Spirit-led ministry of the church continues to break boundaries, bringing wholeness through Jesus. And this has personal and social dimensions, and we see in the church that it's by serving those who are on the outside, by associating with those who are on the outside, and this is perfectly in line with the ministry of Jesus. So what was one of the chief complaints that the Pharisees, the leaders of the temple, had against Jesus? He hung out with sinners. He hung out with sinners. They call him a glutton and a drunkard because he hung out with sinners too hard. He partied too much with sinners, people that were on the outside. That Jesus was constantly with those on the outside. The people that he chose in his ministry were those who were on the outside. Fishermen. Those that were, nothing wrong with being a fisherman in the culture, but yet these aren't necessarily the people who you're picking to be your disciples, people who you're wanting to emulate you, wanting to be exactly like you, to carry on your ministry. You're choosing normally they say we choose the best and the brightest, the people who, have been to all the school and have the degrees and they can do it. And these are blue-collar workers. Within that group, we see a tax collector, someone who would have been seen as a national traitor. We see a zealot, someone who saw the path of God and bringing about God's reign happen through violence. Jesus in Matthew 25, speaking about the coming kingdom, says, "The king will say, 'You are blessed by my Father, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me.'" All people that are vulnerable and on the outside. And when they say, "Well, Lord, when did we see you?" He says, "If you've done this to the least of these, you've done it to me." So where do we find God and where do we find Jesus? With the people on the outside, the people who are in need. So who are those people this day? It's a really broad question. Sometimes it can be hard to answer. But if we want to stand with Jesus, we must stand with those who are on the outside. So who's on the outside? You can ask, who is not seen? Or who is seen and they don't have a voice? Who are the voiceless? Who is alone? Who is vulnerable? Who is oppressed? Who is sick? Who doesn't find a home in the church? Who doesn't feel welcome in the church? And so when we think about this, there's these different kind of levels or realms. And so the first one you think of kind of the big picture, and you think large people groups, you think nationally or globally. And so you think of gender equality, LGBTQ community. Think of racism. Think of people with disabilities. You think of widows. Think of orphans. You can think geographically, things that, that are going on in different places, war-torn areas and refugees and famine, people that need clean water, people that suffer because they lack economic opportunities, people that suffer from diseases or persecution. These very broad strokes. The trouble I have with, identifying those, and sometimes, our heartstrings, they pull on these different areas and these different people. It's tough to put a face and a name to it or figure out, what am I supposed to do? So I think in the last couple weeks, as there's been this public outcry from across the spectrum that no matter where you are politically, where you are, it doesn't matter. We like families to be together, and separating families is less than ideal. And so on our border, when that's happening across the board, people, we don't like this, we don't like this. And when the struggle, what can you do about it? What do you do? I mean, you can pray. I call my representatives, but what tangibly can you do? And sometimes when we have these big issues, it's tough to be able to say, what can I tangibly do? And so I think what is helpful, and where you see the most difference, is not to forget about the bigger issues, but kind of break it down. Where do I see this in my community? That makes it much easier. So you start to think about neighborhoods. You start to think about schools. You start to think about your community needs. And then suddenly people have faces. There's a geographic area. They start to have names. And this is one of the places where the church oftentimes is able and easiest for them to be able to get involved. So you think of some of the things that we do here. In a few weeks, you'll hear about the Backpack Project. What is the Backpack Project? We collect supplies for students that may not be able to have, all the supplies they need at the start of school. And so somebody who may have felt like an outsider at the start of school is not pushed to the edge, is not excluded, but they feel good. They feel good about themselves, better about themselves because they have supplies. You think of the Mother's Day Shoe Project or Shoe Fund, and we gather funds so that kids can have shoes when they go to school. You think of our Love and Action ministries to those that need a meal, need some community. You think of our foot washing event, which provides medical attention to our homeless population, mainly foot attention, giving them shoes and giving them socks. These are, this is tangible things that can happen. And so you take these big ticket items and you think, okay, we can do something here as a church in these areas. But also you can break it even further down into your personal, because we all know people who are on the outside and all have felt like we've been on the outside. And it doesn't necessarily have to fall into one of the big items out there. It doesn't have to be somebody that falls into an oppressed people group, but just somebody who is on the outside. You think of the idea when you think of school and young kids and the kid that sits alone at the table at the cafeteria. We see things like that each and every day. It may be the person down the road that just is lonely and needs a visit. The person who's in a hospital that needs a visit. Somebody that just needs a kind word. The person that works with you and they're kind of ostracized or they don't fit in. We run across it all the time, each and every day. And so the first thing, and how we do this, how we begin to find Jesus in these outsiders, in these outside places, the first thing is to pay attention. Sometimes that's the hardest thing, is just paying attention. It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness of our lives that we don't open our eyes to the people that we pass by each and every day. That in some way, shape, or form, everybody has felt like an outsider in their life. And so we pass them, we know their names, we know their faces, and it's just paying attention to the ways that God tugs upon your heart. That's probably the most important thing. That's probably 95% of this, is just paying attention. You can pray. You think, pray, we think about, God acting, but prayer also, and I would say more often we see prayers answered by the ways that it changes us. And so when you begin to pray for somebody in earnest, pray for a situation, pray for people, it begins to connect your heart with theirs. And oftentimes I think the answer to our prayers is found in the person who is praying. We can pray, and then we can choose something to do, an action. You don't have to change the world in one sweep. You don't have to be out there and be Superman or Superwoman and change everything and just make it all better. Just choose one thing, because sometimes doing one thing can have results beyond what you could speculate. I was reminded of this in the last week with my daughter. She's at camp. She goes to camp during the summer, so she was at theater camp. And one of her friends went with her. And so, they were buddies. If you're going to a camp with new people, you want to know one person. And so this little girl suffers from celiac disease, and she literally just can't touch stuff with gluten on it or she has to be very careful because even if she just touches it and gets it on her mouth, she can have it can have serious effects on her. And so she has to be wary of that. And oftentimes, when you have treats and stuff in the class, they're not gluten-free, but the mom does a great job of making sure that things are provided for her and that she has stuff for her child to feel like she's not on the outside. And so something happened during that week, and there was cupcakes. And this little girl couldn't partake of it. So everybody else in the group got a cupcake, but this little girl couldn't. And so my daughter decided that she wasn't going to have a cupcake. Tiniest little thing. And yet somebody who was on the outside didn't feel like they were on the outside anymore. Do we not have those each and every day? Do we not run across them each and every day? And if we are seriously trying to imitate Jesus, trying to find Jesus, we need to look to the outside. Those who are in need, those who are oppressed, those who are on the fringes. And there we will find Jesus. And not by sweeping in and rescuing everyone, but by planting mustard seeds. There's a reason that Jesus used mustard seed as an example of the kingdom. It's small. It's insignificant. But over time, it can blossom into something that is huge, is great, that can change the world. And I think in the book of Acts, yes, you see the fireworks and you see the huge things, but by and large, the story of the church is not fireworks that turn the world upside down, but it is a million tiny flames that are carried by you and me each and every day that turns the world upside down. That is the strength of the church. And so as you go out, may you find Jesus, but may you find him in unexpected places. And as you leave the inside and go to those who are on the outside, may you find Jesus standing there right next to you. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.